If you're enjoying this epic journey of resistance, justice, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll stay up to date on all the new stories we'll be creating together. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters of our series. If Elizabeth's struggle and her courage to change the world have inspired you, share this content with your friends and help spread this message of empowerment. Also, leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story and what else you'd like to see here. Heiress Elizabeth Hawke walked through the frigid corridors of the Hawke Mansion, an imposing building that stood like a monument to the industrial empire her family had built. The sounds of workers toiling in the factory furnaces miles away reached her as a constant reminder of the power her family held over the entire city. It was a world of steel and coal, of secret contracts and treacherous alliances. From a young age, Elizabeth had known that her destiny was already written. She would be the successor to her father, Samuel Hawke, a man whose heavy hand controlled the entire industrial empire. His intelligence and ruthless character were the foundation of the family fortune, but Elizabeth did not share his vision. The young heiress was unlike any other member of the family. With a restless spirit and a curious mind, she spent hours in her father's office, devouring books on workers' rights and the power of the working class. She couldn't understand how those men and women could be treated as disposable parts in a machine that generated wealth for a few, while condemning so many to misery. Unlike her father, who saw himself as a master of power and control, Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility. She knew that as heiress, she should keep the family legacy intact, but her morals, her ideas, were in direct conflict with the system her father had created. It was night when an unexpected meeting took place. Elizabeth's father, a tireless businessman as cold as the steel he produced, summoned her for a private meeting. The subject, the future of the empire. Samuel Hawke, with his deep voice and calculating gaze, offered his daughter a proposition. She should take the helm of the factory, take his place by his side, and ensure that the business continued on its traditional path. Elizabeth was paralyzed, not only by the weight of the offer, but also by the irony of being chosen to maintain a system she abhorred. Her father trusted her, but she no longer trusted what he represented. How could she suddenly accept a burden that afflicted her so much? Elizabeth's decision was about to shape not only her family's future, but also the fate of all those who depended on the gigantic industry her father had built. As her father passed the baton to her, something in Elizabeth's heart warmed. She knew something needed to change, but doubt consumed her. What would become of her family if she made such a radical decision? And what would become of her people, the exploited workers, if she remained in the shadow of her father's legacy? This was just the beginning of a silent revolution. What would you do in Elizabeth's place? Would you accept your family's legacy or challenge everything that has been built? Share your opinion in the comments. Elizabeth woke the next morning with a knot in her stomach. She knew her decision would resonate beyond the walls of her home. The Hawke Empire wasn't just a factory, it was a force that dominated the local economy, shaped politics, and controlled the lives of thousands. The city streets were teeming with men and women toiling away at the factory furnaces, their faces covered in coal soot and their bodies worn down by the brutal routine. Elizabeth could no longer ignore the stories she heard from her employees. She knew her father demanded perfection. Any mistake, any failure, was punished with the loss of a job, and in a town like hers, losing a job meant losing everything. The Hawke family prided themselves on their efficiency, but to Elizabeth, it represented pure exploitation. It was impossible not to question the price that progress cost those who were kept on the margins. As she walked through the city streets the day after meeting her father, Elizabeth spotted the workers during one of their rare breaks. She saw a grey-haired man, his face marked by the harshness of labor, looking at her with tired but defiant eyes. He was one of the union leaders, a group that had been increasingly opposing the subhuman conditions in the factory. She knew that unions were gaining strength, but her father had always been relentless in his repression of these movements. The workers' struggle seemed distant, but something within her drew her to those men and women. Elizabeth had an impulse. She approached the man, who recognized her immediately. He was aware of who she was, but his gaze wasn't one of admiration. It was one of distrust. The fact that she was Samuel Hawke's daughter didn't make her any different in his eyes. They were on opposite sides, and he didn't know if he could trust her. "You're tired of seeing things your way, aren't you, Mrs. Hawke?" he said with a bitter smile. Elizabeth hesitated, but her answer was firm. "I'm not like my father. He only sees numbers, while you see people. I see that too." The man observed her more closely, his eyes softening slightly, but the distrust was still there. He knew the Hawkes always played strategically. Words are easy, but actions, those are difficult. "What are you really willing to do to change this?" he asked. Elizabeth remained silent for a moment, absorbing the force and tension of that question. She didn't have the answers he expected. What could she do to destroy her father's empire, or rather, to reform it from within? Her position as heiress offered possibilities, but it also placed her on a tortuous path. She would need to be more than just a dissenting voice within the family. She would need allies. As the days passed, Elizabeth began attending the union's secret meetings. She disguised herself, wearing simple clothes so as not to attract attention. But with each meeting, she felt more determined. The stories she heard deeply affected her. Workers who had been injured and never received medical assistance, children who died from work-related illnesses in the mines, families destroyed by the lack of decent living conditions. The oppression was palpable. Meanwhile, at home, her father increased the pressure. He knew Elizabeth was torn, and he wouldn't allow her to be out of his sight for long. He insisted she prepare to take over the business, reinforcing the fact that she was dealing with a great responsibility. For Samuel, the empire was more than a legacy. It was his identity, and he had no intention of letting anyone, not even his daughter, challenge him. Elizabeth's dilemma was becoming increasingly clear. She had to choose between following in her father's footsteps and perpetuating oppression, or defying everything and risking losing everything, including her family. But something within her was driving her toward the workers' side, toward the fight for justice. She knew that, in doing so, she would face forces far greater than she could ever imagine. Do you think Elizabeth is making the right decision by siding with the workers' union? Or should she try to change things from within without risking her place in the family? What would you do in her place? Elizabeth's dilemma wasn't limited to secret conversations in the shadows. Her father, Samuel Hawke, soon realized something was wrong. He summoned her to increasingly frequent meetings, pressuring her to formally accept the leadership of Hawke Industries. His patience was wearing thin, and he now looked at her with a coldness Elizabeth had never seen before. "Elizabeth, I don't understand what's happening to you," Samuel said in one of their private meetings, his voice deep and authoritative. "You have everything anyone could want. A bright future, an immense fortune, and yet you're willing to throw it all away for senseless causes." Elizabeth, who had remained calm until then, finally yielded to the pressure. "It's not pointless, Father. People out there are suffering. They deserve more than a miserable existence just so we can accumulate more wealth." Samuel stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "You're young and naive. The world works in a much more complex way than you imagine. The empire I built isn't just about profit. It's about power, about control. It's about ensuring that progress continues, and if you don't understand that soon, you'll destroy everything our family has built." But Elizabeth was no longer the young woman who accepted her father's words without question. The tension within her was growing. She knew she was drifting away from everything she knew, from her family, from what she had been taught to respect and protect. She wanted change, not just for herself, but for all those whose lives were dominated by her father's indifference. Meanwhile, the workers, through the union, began to organize more intensely. Elizabeth became increasingly close to key figures in the labor movement, such as John Richards, the union leader. Her intelligence and determination began to attract attention, and she soon came to be seen as a fundamental ally in the fight against the abuses of the Hawke family. On a cold night, after yet another secret meeting with the workers, Elizabeth received an urgent message. Her ever-vigilant father had discovered something. She had learned from the messenger's words that Samuel had someone within the union who was selling information about the meetings. Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, knowing she was dealing with forces no longer within her control. Her father would not hesitate to take drastic measures to protect his interests. She ran to the union's hideout, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. There she found John Richards, who was tense and worried. "What happened, Elizabeth?" he asked, immediately noticing her distressed state. "My father, he knows everything," she replied, her face pale. "He will destroy our cause if he continues like this." "We have to act fast," John said, his expression resolute. "We're going to need your support, and you're going to have to make a choice." "We can't wait any longer." Elizabeth remained silent, observing the people around her. The decision she made now would affect not only the future of Hawke Industries, but also the lives of all those who stood by her side in the fight. She knew that the risk of losing everything, including her family, was great, but the injustice of the system was even greater. "I'm with you," Elizabeth said, her voice firm despite the emotional storm consuming her. "But we need to be smart. I need more time." "We can't act rashly." John looked at her with respect, but there was something in his eyes that Elizabeth couldn't identify. It was the look of someone who knew the real battle was about to begin. The following morning, she was summoned by her father again. He was angry, more so than ever. The pressure on her was mounting, but now Elizabeth knew she could no longer back down. It would no longer be just a matter of inheriting the company or continuing her father's legacy. It would be a matter of direct confrontation. "You have deeply disappointed me," said Samuel, his voice cold. "If you don't get back in line, I will take action against all these unruly workers. You will be responsible for their destruction." Elizabeth looked at him without hesitation. "I'm not afraid of you, father." He stared at her, the atmosphere tense. She knew there was no turning back. The conflict was set. The clash between the two visions, her father's empire and the revolution she now championed, was inevitable. Elizabeth has already made her choice. She is willing to confront her own father and destroy the family empire. Do you think she made the right decision, or was she reckless? What would you do in her place? The following days passed in a whirlwind of decisions and silent confrontations. Elizabeth no longer had time to hesitate. She had become deeply involved in the union's actions, helping to devise strategies to undermine her father's power base. Her allies were increasingly confident in her leadership, but at the same time, the pressure from her family was mounting. Samuel Hawke had intensified his attempts to control her. Every time she left the house, he watched her closely, trying to discover her intentions. He used psychological manipulation, making Elizabeth feel guilty for anything that went against the company's interests. However, the more pressured she felt, the stronger her commitment to the workers' cause became. But it wasn't just Samuel who was on Elizabeth's radar. Members of high society, those who directly benefited from the family empire, began to question her actions. When they learned of her relationship with the union, many tried to get her back in her place. Some influential figures in the city, with whom Samuel maintained a relationship of favors and business dealings, secretly sought out Elizabeth. "Do you really want to lose all of this, Elizabeth?" asked a familiar voice, that of Henry Sinclair, one of her father's main allies and one of the factory's largest shareholders. "We know you mean well, But change comes at a price. What you're doing now is ruining our city." Henry had been a friend of her mother, who had died when Elizabeth was still young, and she felt a connection with him. But that afternoon, seeing the disapproving look on his face, she realized he was more concerned with the impact of his actions on the future of the empire than with the well-being of the workers. "I can no longer ignore what I see, Henry. This isn't about keeping up appearances. This is about human lives," she replied, with a firmness she herself was only beginning to discover. Henry watched her silently for a few seconds. Then he sighed wearily. "I know you want to change things, but true change, Elizabeth, requires sacrifices. Great sacrifices, not just words." These words echoed in Elizabeth's mind for days. She knew that, however much her heart belonged to the workers, she was unprepared for the repercussions her revolution would cause. But at the same time, the idea of yielding to the status quo seemed like an irreparable betrayal to those who trusted her. Furthermore, the situation at the factory was becoming unsustainable. Elizabeth began receiving information from within the company about the growing dissatisfaction among the workers. The strikes were intensifying, and even with Elizabeth's support, the workers were beginning to take more risks. There were already rumors that the union leaders were being followed and threatened, and even worse, the most dissatisfied employees were beginning to plan violent actions against the factory. Elizabeth knew she needed to act more quickly. But what to do when the enemy was not just an impersonal empire, but a web of personal, political, and economic interests as deep as the city she lived in? And then a new complication arose. During a clandestine meeting with John Richards, the union leader, Elizabeth discovered that some members of the movement were beginning to act on their own, without following the strategy she and the others had established. A radical group was preparing an attack on the factory, which could compromise the entire movement and endanger the lives of many workers. "Elizabeth, we need to make a decision," John said, his face tense. "These men won't wait any longer. They want change by force, and that could be dangerous. Are you going to stop this, or are we going to move forward?" Elizabeth was silent for a moment. She knew that somehow her leadership was being tested. What had once seemed to be a movement for justice was beginning to fragment in different directions, and she wasn't sure which one to follow. She felt the responsibility to guide her allies, but she was also afraid that things would get out of control. "If we go down this road, John, there's no turning back. You know that, right? And I can't allow this to put lives at risk. Let's focus on negotiation. But if that doesn't work—" She paused, knowing that the reality of the war she was fighting was darker than she could have imagined. The movement was at a crossroads. It was no longer just about challenging her father's empire. The real dilemma was deciding how far she was willing to go and what sacrifices she was willing to make, both for herself and for those who depended on her. Elizabeth is now facing escalating violence and the risks of revolution. Should she support a more aggressive attack or attempt a peaceful and strategic solution? What would you do in her place? The days following the meeting with John Richards were the most tense of Elizabeth's life. The city was on the verge of social collapse. Strikes and protests were becoming more frequent, and worker frustration was reaching its peak. Meanwhile, inside Hawk Industries, Samuel was taking drastic measures to prevent chaos. He had hired mercenaries to patrol the factories, subtly threatening anyone who dared to challenge the order. Elizabeth knew her position was becoming increasingly untenable. Pressure was coming from all sides, from her father, from her allies in high society, and even from her own allies in the labor movement. It was a silent war, fought on the grounds of personal choices, and she didn't know how long she could maintain it before violence erupted. It was on a cold morning, while preparing for yet another clandestine meeting with John and other union members, that the turning point occurred. Elizabeth was summoned to her father's office. She knew this meeting would be different from all the others. Samuel was becoming more ruthless, more determined to maintain control. When she entered the room, she found him waiting with a grim expression. "You know what's going on, don't you?" Samuel said, his voice a menacing whisper. "The workers are revolting, and you're being seen as the leader of it, which makes me believe you're a traitor to our family. You're destroying everything we've built." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She had never heard her father speak like that before. He seemed less like a father and more like a man fighting to save his empire, no matter the cost. "I'm not a traitor, father," she said, trying to remain calm. "I'm trying to save people from the destruction you caused. But I'm not foolish enough not to see what you're doing. Workers are dying, and you're only increasing the repression." Samuel stood up, his angry gaze causing Elizabeth's muscles to tense. "Do you really think this is about the workers? They're just numbers, Elizabeth. The real battle isn't about the workers. The real battle is keeping the empire intact, because without it, we are nothing." Those words cut like a blade. She could no longer see the man she had known. The father who had always loved her was now revealing his true face, someone willing to destroy everything to maintain power. "I can't go on like this, father," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't be complicit in this any longer." It was at that moment that the real turning point occurred. Samuel, his eyes filled with anger and contempt, stared intently at her and said, "If you don't back down, you'll be the one to destroy this family. And you'll start by watching the deaths of the people you claim to protect." Without another word, he signaled to the guards in the room. Elizabeth tried to resist, but they caught her by surprise and pushed her out. She tried to scream, but her voice was muffled. She knew what was coming. Her father had made a decision. He had deemed her a traitor, and now he would act to silence her, no matter the means. When Elizabeth was finally released, her heart was heavy. She didn't know what to expect. That moment had marked the line between loyalty to her family and loyalty to her people. But one thing was clear. The war had begun, and she would be the catalyst for it. Upon leaving the room, Elizabeth ran to the safest place she knew, the secret workshop where the syndicate met. Entering, she found John Richards waiting for her. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The expression on his face said it all. "It's time to act," John said, his voice tense. "Are you sure you're ready?" Elizabeth looked into John's eyes, and for the first time she felt that something stronger than her own fear was guiding her. She knew what she had to do. There was no turning back now. Her confrontation with the Hawk Industries empire was inevitable, and she was ready to face the consequences. "Yes," she replied with unwavering determination. "I'm ready." This is the crucial moment. Elizabeth is now ready to confront her own father and the family empire. Do you think she made the right decision, or should she have tried a less radical solution? What would you do in her place? Elizabeth's decision was made, and the consequences began to unfold faster than she could have imagined. News of her confrontation with Samuel Hawke leaked into the city, unleashing a whirlwind of reactions among the workers and high society. For the laborers, she became a symbol of resistance, a leader willing to fight against an oppressive empire. But for her family and allies, Elizabeth was a traitor who had refused to preserve her lineage's legacy. The reactions within Hawk Industries were immediate. Samuel, enraged, ordered factory operations to be intensified. He redoubled security and began implementing an even harsher regime against any attempt at insurgency. It was clear that he believed he needed to crush any attempt at revolution, and he would do anything to achieve it. Elizabeth knew that the path she had chosen would not be easy. She now faced not only her father, but an entire system that was willing to destroy her and everything she represented. Her own blood and lineage were against her. But what kept her strong was the gaze of the workers, the hope that shone in the eyes of those who had never had a voice. That night, Elizabeth's phone rang in her clandestine apartment, and she answered without hesitation. It was John Richards, the union leader, urgently seeking her assistance. "Elizabeth, there's something you need to know. Samuel's mercenaries are on the move. They've already started arresting union leaders. I don't know if the movement will survive this," he said, the concern evident in his voice. "We can't let that happen," she replied quickly. "We need to act now. If Samuel wants war, then he'll have war." Elizabeth knew the battle was being fought on two fronts, inside the factory and in the streets. While her father used his influence to crush any resistance with brute force, Elizabeth needed to find a way to gain popular support. The movement couldn't just be an uprising of a small group of workers. It needed to involve the community in a common cause. She called a meeting with the remaining labor leaders and some sympathizers of the cause. The plan was clear. It would no longer be possible to act in the shadows. They needed to make their struggle visible, precise, and effective. The idea of a direct attack on the factory was discarded. She knew that would only increase repression. Instead, Elizabeth and her allies began to devise a plan to destabilize the Hawk Empire from within. Through strategic sabotage on the production lines and, most importantly, a general strike that would shut down the factory. The pressure within the city was mounting. The workers gathered in secret locations, armed with nothing more than their determination. They knew they were in a fight for survival, and Elizabeth was becoming the face of this resistance. However, she also knew she was becoming an even bigger target for her father, who would not hesitate to take drastic measures to crush the revolt. Meanwhile, Samuel's response was brutal. He ordered the arrest of several leaders of the labor movement, and rumors began to circulate that mercenaries were already lying in wait, prepared to eliminate anyone seen as a threat. Elizabeth felt the weight of guilt. Each passing day without a solution was a day in which more lives were risked, more friends were being arrested, and she herself was drifting further away from her own humanity. She knew that in the end, what was at stake was not just the future of Hawk Industries, but the future of an entire class of people who would live or die depending on their ability to resist. It was a war where there were no easy winners, and she was at the center of it all, a point of confrontation between the old and the new, the past and the future. But with each passing day, Elizabeth felt more certain of her choice. If the price of fighting for freedom was losing everything she loved, she was willing to pay it, because in the end, what she feared most was looking back and realizing she never had the courage to fight for what was right. Elizabeth is paying a high price for her decision. Do you think it's worth sacrificing so much for the workers' cause? Or should she try a more peaceful path? What would be her limit of sacrifice? What began as an impulsive revolt had transformed into a war for justice. Elizabeth, now at the head of a growing movement, was no longer the uncertain young heiress who doubted her choices. She had molded herself, forged in the daily battles and the hardships of fighting against her own father. Tensions had never been higher, but what she felt was not just the weight of responsibility. She felt for the first time the true taste of power. The power to challenge an empire, to be the change she had always dreamed of. But there was also a new understanding of the price of this struggle. The workers were now united as never before, and Elizabeth felt that the fight she was waging was not only for them, but also for herself, for her own soul. The sacrifices had been many, and the deepest losses were only beginning to reveal themselves. The movement was taking on a new form. Although the strikes and sabotage had had a significant impact on Hawk Industries' production, Elizabeth knew the real blow would be psychological. The fight was no longer just against her father's industrial empire, but against the very fear he had instilled in the people. Samuel had cultivated the idea that without Hawk Industries, the city would sink. He always talked about the need for a strong leader, someone who knew how to conduct business to ensure progress. But as the weeks passed, Elizabeth began to realize that she was, in fact, proving that an alternative could exist. She could be that leader, but in a completely different way. She was no longer the heiress. She was now the leader of a popular movement, and that changed her in ways she didn't yet fully understand. Observing the tired faces of the workers, their determined eyes, she saw the transformation taking place within them. They were no longer just cogs in a machine. They were beginning to believe they could be more, that they could take control of their own destinies. With each meeting with the workers, with each message sent to the city, Elizabeth felt more connected to a cause that transcended the factory itself. She knew that the resistance was becoming something bigger than she had ever imagined. But, at the same time, the pressure from her father never lessened. Samuel was not the type of man to admit defeat. He began to use his power and influence to attack the movement's foundations. The mercenaries were in the field, the repression intensified, and the workers began to be forced to make decisions that could ruin their lives. One night, Elizabeth was summoned to an urgent meeting with John Richards and other union leaders. The landscape had shifted. Her father's empire was beginning to crumble. Financial losses and the negative impact of weeks of strikes had weakened Samuel's control over the city. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that, in a last desperate move, Samuel had decided to call a meeting with the main leaders of the union movement. He wanted to negotiate, but his intentions were anything but peaceful. It was a trick. He planned to capture all the leaders and end the movement once and for all. "Elizabeth, we can't wait any longer," said John, the gravity of the situation evident in his eyes. "They're coming after us. Your father will use every weapon he has. We need to act now, or we'll all be destroyed." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She knew this was the time. There would be no more opportunities, no more empty promises of a better future. Either she took control now, or all the sacrifices she had made would be in vain. "We're ready," she said, her voice filled with fierce determination. "We're going to show Samuel that he can't buy people, that he can't crush the dreams of an entire city." It was one of the hardest decisions Elizabeth had ever had to make. She knew the real battle was about to begin, and for her, what was at stake wasn't just the future of the factory or her father's empire. It was the future of all those who believed in her cause, in the promises of a better, fairer world. She needed to ensure that the movement wasn't just a revolution, but a true transformation. From that moment on, she would become the leader she was born to be. But she also knew that her future was more uncertain than ever. When the confrontation with her father happened, there would be no turning back. She would lose everything, her family, her legacy, but in return, she would gain something far more significant, her own freedom. Elizabeth is now making difficult decisions and becoming a true leader. Do you believe she should continue with the revolution, even knowing she will lose everything she has ever known? Or would it be wiser to seek a middle ground? What would you do in her place? The air in the city was thick with palpable tension. Elizabeth knew the final battle was drawing near. Everything she had done so far, every secret meeting, every tactical move, every fiery speech, had been a step toward this moment. But she also knew that what lay ahead would be the hardest of all. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. The resistance was about to confront Samuel's empire in an irreversible way. For weeks, Elizabeth and her allies had been preparing their last card, a general strike that would paralyze the entire city. She knew this would be the breaking point. If Samuel didn't yield to the workers' demands, she would have no choice but to force a direct confrontation. But this decision was not without risks. The strike could not only destroy the last production line at Hawk Industries, but also jeopardize the lives and freedom of everyone involved. Alongside John Richards, Elizabeth prepared to take the next step. The operation was ready. She had arranged with the union leaders for all the workers to stop work at the same time, creating an instant shutdown that would affect the factories and local businesses. But before anything else, there was something else Elizabeth needed to do, something personal, something that could be her last chance to avoid a violent escalation. She knew that the only way to prevent more bloodshed was to confront her father directly. Samuel, though dangerous, wouldn't be unbeatable if she could persuade him to negotiate. He was still a man of principle, albeit warped, and most importantly, he was still her father. In a moment of pure courage, Elizabeth decided to arrange a private meeting with Samuel. She knew he wouldn't expect a reconciliation proposal, but she believed she had something more to offer, something that could turn the tide in her favor. "You found me on my own turf, daughter," Samuel said in his private meeting room. He didn't seem surprised. There was something calculating and cold in his eyes, as if he knew this would happen eventually. "I didn't come here to compete for power with you, father," Elizabeth said, her voice firmer than she had ever imagined she could muster. "I came here to prevent a war, to prevent the workers from risking themselves in a violent confrontation." Samuel watched her in silence, and for a moment Elizabeth believed he could actually hear what she was saying. But then he leaned forward, his words cutting through the air. "Do you think you can stop me with words? That you can prevent the empire from being destroyed just because you have good intentions? The only way to control all of this, Elizabeth, is by keeping power in the right hands. And I will never give in to you." "I'm not asking you to give in, Dad," she replied, with a calmness she barely recognized in herself. "I'm asking you to stop, not to crush those who are fighting for a better future. They are not numbers to be discarded. They are human beings, and they deserve to be treated with dignity." Samuel's gaze hardened. "You don't understand. They don't know what they're asking. And you, daughter, are about to become another victim of this. It will destroy our family. It will destroy everything." The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and Elizabeth knew this was the point of no return. There were no more words that could be said to change her father's mind. He wasn't listening anymore. He had already chosen his path, and Elizabeth, as much as she wished to avoid the confrontation, knew it was inevitable. With no other option, she gave the signal for the strike to begin. It was the beginning of the end. When the first worker stopped his machine, others followed, and soon the entire factory was silent. The impact was immediate. The city came to a standstill. Cars piled up in the streets, shops closed, and Hawk Industries, the city's economic mainstay, was forced to halt production. Elizabeth's resistance had dealt its first major blow, but as she knew, that wouldn't be enough to defeat Samuel. The final confrontation was about to happen. He would take his measures, and the ensuing battle would be decisive for everyone's future. Her father's empire wouldn't fall easily, but Elizabeth was more than ready for whatever came. The war was on her terms now. The clock was ticking. She was no longer afraid of losing, only of not fighting. Elizabeth has now put everything on the line with the general strike. Do you think she made the right decision in initiating a direct confrontation with her father? Or should she have tried peaceful negotiation one more time? What would you do in her place? The sun had barely begun to set when the final confrontation took place. The carefully planned general strike brought the city to the brink of collapse. The streets were packed with workers and ordinary citizens supporting the cause. Hawk Industries was paralyzed, its gates closed and its workers on strike, but Samuel Hawke, unbeatable until that moment, was not willing to lose his empire without a fight. Elizabeth was at the center of it all. She felt the overwhelming pressure of knowing that the future of thousands of people was in her hands, but she also felt for the first time a clarity she had never experienced before. This was her fight. Her decision. She had the final say on the fate of her family, her father, and the future of all who believed that justice was possible. Inside a makeshift meeting room, with union leaders and their allies, Elizabeth looked at all the faces watching her with hope and fear. The tension was palpable, and everyone knew they were about to make history. "If Samuel doesn't give in now, we'll have to take more drastic measures," said John Richards, his voice heavy with weariness, but also with unwavering determination. Elizabeth looked at him, her gaze resolute. It's no longer about giving in. It's about ending all of this, once and for all. If he doesn't want to negotiate, he'll have to face the consequences of his actions. And we can't hesitate any longer. As the conversation unfolded, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, a messenger burst into the room, breathless, with a letter from Samuel Hawke. Elizabeth read it silently, its contents completely unexpected. Samuel, in a move no one had anticipated, was calling an emergency meeting with representatives from the resistance and the company to try to resolve the situation before violence erupted. Elizabeth knew this might be her last chance to avoid an armed confrontation. But there was something about her father that disconcerted her. He wasn't asking for negotiation. He was offering an ultimatum with veiled threats that, if the movement didn't back down, the repression would be total and irrevocable. The message was clear. Either they accepted his conditions, or the city would see civil war. She took a deep breath. The decision had to be quick. She couldn't allow any more lives to be lost. At the same time, she knew Samuel was using a psychological tactic, trying to play on the fear and uncertainty he knew she carried. It was his last attempt to regain control without losing everything at once. "Let's go to the meeting," Elizabeth said finally. "But we must be prepared. I will not give in to any more blackmail. We will negotiate, but in a way that shows we are in control." When she arrived at the meeting place, Elizabeth found her father seated at a large table, surrounded by his advisors and allies. He didn't seem surprised by her presence, but rather more calculating, as if he had been expecting her. "So you decided to face the inevitable," Samuel said, his voice as cold as ever. "I thought you were more sensible." Elizabeth looked at him with a firm gaze. "It's not about being sensible, Dad. It's about doing what's right. You made choices based on fear and control, but what you forgot is that people are tired of being treated like disposable parts." Samuel watched her with a bitter smile. "You've always been good with words, daughter, but words won't save your revolution. They don't know what they're asking for. I'm the only one capable of keeping this city in order. Without me, it all falls apart." "You're wrong, Father," Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "True strength comes from the people, not from an empire built on exploitation. That's why I'm here, to make you understand that." Then something shifted in the air. Samuel, in a swift movement, rose from his chair, his expression fiercer than ever. "You'll see, daughter. You'll see what happens when a revolution is pushed too far." Suddenly, the tension in the room increased dramatically. Samuel signaled to his bodyguards, who immediately approached Elizabeth and the other leaders of the movement. She realized the situation was spiraling out of control. The negotiation she had hoped for was turning into an ambush. Samuel wasn't interested in resolving the conflict. He wanted to eliminate the resistance once and for all. What followed was a true battle of wills. Elizabeth, realizing the impending coup, signaled for her allies to retreat. It wasn't the fight she desired, but she knew there was no other choice. Negotiation had failed, and direct confrontation was about to happen. Enraged, Samuel ordered the mercenaries to attack, but it was at that moment that Elizabeth made a final decision. She would not fight with weapons. She would fight with her willpower, with her ability to inspire others not to back down, not to succumb to fear. It was her last chance, and she knew that losing control now would mean losing forever. With a powerful cry, she and her allies advanced, facing the repression with unexpected courage. She knew that the real battle was not in her hands alone, but in the hands of all who supported her. It was during this moment of confrontation that the true revolution began to take shape. The final confrontation arrived. Elizabeth faced her father decisively, but he was unwilling to yield. Do you think she took the right course of action, defying her father to the end? Or should she have sought another way to avoid physical confrontation? What would you do if you were in her place? The city was in ruins. What had begun as a revolution in the name of justice and equality now had an irreversible price. The streets were littered with rubble, shops looted, and makeshift barricades erected by the workers themselves, who resisted until the very end. Samuel Hawke's once unshakable empire had been brought down, but victory came at an immense cost. Many had lost their lives. Violence had been an inevitable part of the transformation, but Elizabeth knew that nothing could erase the suffering of the victims. She stood atop the hill where, years ago, she had seen the grand Hawke Industries factory. Now, the building was ablaze, consumed by the revolution she herself had helped to ignite. Smoke rose to the sky, carrying with it the remnants of her father's empire and all that it stood for. She didn't know what she felt. There was both relief and pain in her chest. The city had been liberated, but at what cost? Beside her, John Richards observed the scene with a worried look. "You did what you had to do, Elizabeth. The city is now yours, the people's, but we cannot forget what we lost along the way." Elizabeth shook her head, unable to answer. Her gaze was fixed on the flames, as if searching for a sign that the pain had been worthwhile. She knew that the fight for justice would never be simple. The city's future would be uncertain, but one thing was clear. She and her allies had changed the destiny of that place forever. Samuel Hawke had not survived the collapse of his empire. During the revolution, he had been captured and brought to trial, but died in custody, a broken man, no longer possessing the power that defined him. He never had the chance to see the true change his daughter would bring about. Elizabeth had won, but not without pain. The weight of losing her own family was something she would have to carry for the rest of her life. The relationship with her father, once one of respect and admiration, was now completely shattered. The factories were in ruins, but the spirit of the workers had never been stronger. They would rise again. Elizabeth knew the road to reconstruction would be arduous, but she was not alone. By her side were the same people who had risen with her, and together they would begin to rewrite the history of a city that now had a new chance. Justice would not come easily, but it was Elizabeth Hawke's legacy. "This is just the beginning," said Elizabeth, finally breaking the silence. John looked at her, understanding what she meant. They still had a lot of work ahead of them. But whatever the future held, Elizabeth was ready to face it. For the first time, she felt that by taking the reins of her own destiny, she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for something much bigger. Elizabeth finally saw her dream of justice realized, but the victory was bittersweet. Do you think Elizabeth's revolution was worth the price she paid, or would change have been possible without so much destruction? What would your balance be between justice and sacrifice? A few years later, the town of Hawke was unrecognizable. The once imposing factories now operated under the control of the workers themselves, who had rebuilt the economy based on cooperation and social justice. Elizabeth, now an emblematic figure of the transformation, never shied away from the struggle, but learned to bear the scars with dignity. Although memories of war and loss still haunted her, she knew she had created a more just future for all. The revolution of her life was not without pain, but it was in it that the true power of the people finally flourished. The city's future is now more just, but Elizabeth paid a high price. Do you think she has finally found peace with her choices, or will the shadow of her struggle haunt her forever? So, what did you think of Elizabeth's journey? Did her fight for justice, her sacrifices and her courage inspire you? Want to know more about the future of Hawke's Town, or how her choices shaped the fate of the workers? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective on the paths of revolution and the challenges of the fight for freedom is important to us. If you enjoyed the story, share it with your friends and help spread this message of resistance and transformation. See you next time.